if you've ever looked at an animal, if you've ever looked at a plant, if you've ever looked at something alive and thought, wow, that is beautiful. How did it get like that? Why is it like that? What is it called? Any of those questions, unfortunately, you're curious about biology. These are biological questions. When you are looking at something that's alive and asking a question about it, that's biology. What I consider to be the most fun part of biology. So biology isn't just cells and genetics. It's also questions like this. And in fact, most people who spend their life studying biology are really interested in something. Like for me, it's fish. I think they're so cool. How do they breathe underwater? Like, that's so awesome. They have a whole life down there. Like, I don't know. I just think they're so cool. So this curiosity is super awesome, and it's actually kind of like a foundational cornerstone of science in general, not just biology. Just being curious, being inquisitive. And it's kind of in your human nature to feel this way about things, to ask questions. I'm sure that most of you are honestly probably pretty curious people. There's a reason why you're choosing your chosen career path. There's a reason why you're in college. And like, yeah, part of it is to, be a productive adult and have a job and make money. But like, there's a reason why you chose the field that you did, right? Whether you are in elementary education and you're curious about little humans, or you're in exercise science and you're curious about the way the body works, or you're in nursing and you're curious about ways to help other people in medicine and all of those things. You get what I'm saying? Everybody's curious about some stuff. So zoos, aquariums, botanic gardens, all of these things are biological systems that you can observe. And if you've ever been to any of them and you've ever asked questions like, what are those two rhinos doing? That's a biological question, right? That's biology. So in this course, I hope to kind of cultivate some of that interest, that curiosity, and direct it towards biology. I will do my best. I think most of you guys, to some extent, are interested in animals or plants, right? Another example of how humans are just kind of curious in general is show of hands, okay? If I said, hey class, next week, let's go to the Grand Canyon. All expenses paid, you don't have to worry about a thing, just show up here 9 o'clock on Friday. Who would be interested in going, right? Yeah, we're curious about stuff. We want to know things, we want to see things, we want to experience things. That is science at its core. Of course, there's more to it, we'll talk about that, but that is what science is. Going and exploring all these things and observing them and doing different things and learning new stuff. That's what it's all about. So biology is taking this curiosity, channeling it, and using it, looking at it in a scientific way. For biology specifically, the prefix bio means life. Ology means study, so study of life, and we prefer to use scientific study of life. Science is an approach to understanding the natural world that's based on inquiry. What is inquiry?
Questioning.
Questioning, yeah. So when you're observing something, you're going to these zoos, you're going to these aquariums, you're asking those questions, that's inquiry. So essentially what we're saying here is science is an approach to understanding things based on asking questions. Science is asking a whole bunch of questions all the time. That's what science is. So in biology, we are asking a whole bunch of questions about life. Yeah, exactly. Make sense? Following along? All right. So in general, scientists, not just biologists, scientists in general, seek natural causes for natural phenomena. What does that mean? We are looking for explanations. In biology, we're looking for explanations about life. Yeah, perfect. Good job. So, scientists in general, though, there's physics, there's math, there's all these things. Natural explanations for this area of interest that they have. So, we focus on the study of structures and processes that can be verifiably observed and measured. So, in science, because we're dealing with the natural world, a lot of this stuff can be, our scientific experiments, the research that we do, is based upon it being able to be tested, being able to be measured, being able to be verified. Does that make sense? You see how this is a little bit different than, say, like religion, where a lot of it, like you can't run a test, you just know, you know what I'm saying? So science is based on items in the natural world, natural phenomena, things that we can observe, and things that we can test. We following? Cool. Okay. So all of this observation and inquisition is essentially a form of exploration. Can you guys hear me okay? In the back? Okay. This is a form of exploration. So how do we develop an interest in something? Generally, it's going to be by observing it. So you have to kind of see it in action to be able to get interested in it in some capacity. So, for example, using a non-scientific example, you wouldn't know that you were interested in playing guitar. You wouldn't know that you were interested in a foreign language unless you saw it in action first, right? You have to be able to observe something, explore the topic before you can ask any questions about it. Does that make sense? So in science, we observe things, we explore them, we ask questions. So, therefore, the first step of science is observation and exploration. We observe things, we explore them, and that's how we start. That's how this interest is cultivated. So, scientifically, this consists of observing organisms in their natural habitat, gathering data, gathering a background information. So, observation and exploration. You never feel like your handwriting is worse than when you're writing on board in front of people. So this step, observation and exploration, leads to questions. So example questions in biology would be, how do fish breathe underwater? I told you, I think that's super cool. Why is the giraffe's neck so long? How do viruses make people sick? Have any of you guys asked these questions before in your life? Has this thought crossed your mind? Right. It's pretty normal and it's pretty natural to have these questions. But you wouldn't have these questions unless you observed that in action first. Does that make sense? By the way, I mentioned this earlier, but the slides are available on Canvas, so you can follow along with the slides if that helps you. Just kind of letting you know if you didn't get that memo earlier. All right, so now we have a whole bunch of questions, but we have to figure out how to find the answers, right? It wouldn't be science if we were just sitting here asking questions all day and not trying to discover any answers. Answers are important. Answers are what keeps the world kind of moving forward, right? So to do that, we must develop a hypothesis. And hopefully in lab this week, you guys got a little bit of experience in developing a hypothesis. A hypothesis is a proposed explanation for a set of observations that must be testable and falsifiable. Have you guys heard the term hypothesis as an educated guess? I want you to throw that definition in the trash, and I want you to learn this one instead. Because two really, really important components of a hypothesis are the fact that they are testable and falsifiable. Okay? So, questions lead to hypothesis. Testable, falsifiable. What does testable mean? It's not a trick question. Yeah?
You could do an experiment.
Yeah, essentially, like, you can see if you're right or not, right? It's testable. You can test it, you can do an experiment, you can research it, you can investigate it. What does falsifiable mean?
Can be proven to be false.
It can be proven to be false. So would a good hypothesis be the world is dying? Can you test that? Can you falsify that? It's not really that clear, right? It should be clearly testifiable and falsifiable. After you develop a hypothesis, this should lead to a pretty clear experimental design. Hopefully you guys explored this in lab this week. Your hypotheses were clear, and so therefore you knew what you had to do for the experiment. Is this what we all saw this week? I don't know what Carrie's section was really up to, but I feel like my section did. So a good hypothesis is going to be so specific that it's going to point to a very clear experimental design. For example, planaria exposed to caffeine will form more C-shapes than planaria exposed to water. That is a very clear, very specific, very testable, and very falsifiable hypothesis. From there, I think if I gave you that hypothesis, just about anybody in this room would be able to come up with a solid experimental design, right? You know what you're doing, you know how to do it. So observational data kind of flows into all of these. Observational data is part of observation and exploration, but it's information that is picked up to help develop this hypothesis and this experiment. Okay? And we actually use this process, observation and explore, ask questions, form a hypothesis, and develop an experiment a lot in everyday life. Here's an example of how you might use this that has very little to do with biology. Let's say that you get out of this class, it's 11:40, and you are exhausted because you went out last night and you got 4 hours of sleep, and you get home and you're kicking off your boots because it's freezing outside, you're putting your coat on, you turn on the light and it doesn't work. As soon as you yell out some profanities and voice your frustrations, the first thing that you're going to do is observe the fact that the light's not working, right? You're going to say, wow, the light didn't work and I clicked the light switch. The next thing that you're going to do, because you have to fix this problem, is say, I bet the light bulb burnt out. Could the light bulb have burnt out? What is going on with the light? This is questioning. See how this questioning is based off of this observation. From there, you're going to come to a very logical conclusion. The light bulb has probably blown. Is this testable? Is this falsifiable? So therefore it is hypothesis. So now we must carry out the experiment and test the hypothesis. We can replace the bulb, turn the light on and off, and see what happens. After we do that, we can come to a conclusion. So let's say the bulb lights up. You have supported your hypothesis, the light bulb must have burned out, right? Let's say it doesn't light up. You have to actually go through this process, go back, ask more questions, and develop a new hypothesis. So from here, if your conclusion is yes, that's hypothesis supported. Do you ever prove a hypothesis? No, you only support them. If you get no, that's a big frown, we're sad. We have to do more research and we have to go back to this step. Does that make sense? This is an example of you doing that in everyday life, because if the light bulb wasn't working, you replaced it, you'd kind of be like, oh, what do I do next, right? And you'd have to come up with more questions and more hypotheses and test them out, or you could just call your landlord. That's probably what I would do. But this is an example. So this process, this, observation, explore, ask questions, hypotheses, is formally called the scientific method. So this is essentially a formalized way of describing scientific discovery. But in the same way that you would change the light bulb at home without thinking about every step of the scientific method, scientists are doing research and not necessarily trying to follow the scientific method. It's just the way that makes the most logical sense. This is the formalized way of describing it. So I do not want you to make the mistake of memorizing these in order. What I want you to do is truly think about what I'm showing you here and make sure it makes sense in your brain. Does this make sense? It's a logical stream of thought. Should you know these terms? Absolutely, you should. If I said, which of the following is not a step in the scientific method, you should be able to answer that question. But I don't want you to just memorize them. I want you to think about how it actually makes sense and how this goes into good science. Because this process of following the scientific method is how all good discoveries in science are made. This is how we were able to develop treatment for AIDS. This is how we were able to develop COVID vaccines. Every big discovery, if you're going into nursing, every new medication, everything like that is following this process. Somebody looks at a question like, oh my gosh, COVID, national pandemic, oh my gosh, or worldwide pandemic. That's an observation. How are we going to stop this? How are we going to develop something that can stop this or prevent this from happening? Hypothesis. They develop a very specific hypothesis about vaccine development, carry out experiments, analyze the data. After repeating this hundreds and hundreds of times, they finally get a yes. Then they send it off to the FDA, who has to, do the same thing a million times over before they can prove it. Anything in science goes through this step. So this is how new discoveries in science are made, from new organisms to COVID vaccine. And this can be modified, like this is kind of an outline. It can be modified and personalized for the type of research that you're doing. But in general, this is the process of scientific discovery. Any questions? All right. So right in the middle here, we have experiments. And experiments can be good and experiments can be bad, right? You guys in your laboratory this week carried out a planaria experiment. And I know in my section I asked at the end of it, do you feel like you could have done this better if you were to do it again right now? And just about everybody said yes, right? Because as you do these things, you learn how to perform and do better experiments. In science, we kind of have some standards that we set for what is good experiments and what are bad experiments. One of those is using a controlled experiment. So a controlled experiment compares groups that differ in as few ways as possible. We want the groups to be as similar as possible. How would your experiment have worked in lab this week if you were comparing planaria to frogs? Would that be effective? No, you wouldn't be looking for the same movements, the same sort of things. You want them to be similar. You want to use the same organism, same environment as much as possible. The only thing that you want to be different is the group, the factor that you're testing. So that results in two groups in an experiment, a control group and an experimental group. So the control group does not receive the factor being tested. The experimental group does receive the factor being tested. This figure right here shows a really good example of that. So the question for the experiment is, will student test scores be affected by distracting sounds in the testing environment? On the left, we have the control group. This is a normal set of students taking an exam in a classroom. On the right hand, we have normal set of students taking an exam in the classroom. The only thing that's different is all of these obnoxious, distracting sounds. That's the experimental group. Does that make sense? So now what if we were to do the same experiment, but instead on the left in the control group, let's say that these students were taking a BIOL 111A midterm exam, right? Now on the left in the control group, let's say we had a bunch of second graders. And on the right, we had a bunch of doctors. Is that good science? No, not good science. We want them to be as similar as possible. We call this using a control. We call this group having a control group. Make sense? Cool. Am I going too fast? Okay. All right. So now the other thing I want to bring up is a next step that happens after the scientific method. After you've got yourself a yes. It is scientific communication. Let's say that you, an SBSU student, really like Bio 111, really like science in general, and you decide to get involved in research on campus. So you get involved with this research on campus and you start working in the laboratory of some sort of faculty member doing science, doing experiments, doing research, right? And let's say that you work really, really hard and you somehow develop the cure for cancer. Okay, that would be awesome, right? We've been looking for that for a really long time. Does that mean anything if you don't tell anybody about it? You're not going to save any lives if nobody knows about it, right? This, super important. There's no way science can move forward if we don't communicate about it. So there's some pretty formalized ways that we have to communicate within the scientific community. So it's really, really important to share the results of your experiment, whether they're good or bad. It's important to tell people when something doesn't work so they don't waste their time doing it. And it's also important to tell somebody when something does work so that they can reap the benefits of your results. Some of the most common ways of sharing scientific information is through seminars, meetings, and scientific publications. So seminars and meetings, if you do get involved in research on campus, you will probably have the opportunity to present a poster of your findings. A lot of you probably did this in grade school, middle school, high school, right? Make a poster for a science project. What you're actually doing is you're representing a scientific meeting. This is something that very real, very professional scientists do to share what they're finding in their research. They also might hold conferences that look a lot like what we're doing right now, classroom type setting, except for instead I would be telling you about all the research I did in my master's program. Scientists get together and they talk about these things to make sure that they're staying up to date in their field. It's important to stay up to date with the latest and greatest science, just like it's important as a doctor or a nurse to stay up to date with the latest medication and treatment methods, right? The other big way that people share scientific information is through scientific publications. So these are some examples of scientific publications. These are some really, really big names, really well-respected publications. Nature, Science, PNAS, Cell, JVC, all of those really big names. So me as a master's student, I spent 2 years working on some scientific research. I poured my heart and soul into it. And right now, I'm in the process of trying to get it published into a journal. Now, should the scientific community trust me, a 27-year-old girl from Bay City, Michigan? Should they trust that my science is good science and just print it out because I say so? Absolutely not. It has to go through a process called peer review. And that is where my research is currently at right now. So peer review is not the peer review that you did in high school where you have your best friend check over your essay and tell you that you did a good job. Peer review in science is terrifying. It is essentially having some of the best experts in the field dissect your work up, down, and sideways and look for any sort of mistakes that you could have made. Now, as scary as it is, it's also super, super important because this is one of the most fundamental ways that we use in science to make sure that misinformation isn't being published or shared. This is how we verify that science is good science and that good stuff is being done in the scientific community so that we can keep our integrity. So peer review is evaluation by a qualified, impartial, and unanimous expert that was not involved in the study. So would it be right if my master's advisor was the peer reviewer? No, he's totally partial. He wants me to be successful. We need somebody who has no idea who I am, where I'm from, what I'm doing, to read my paper and say if it's good science. And in this process, it's not just one peer reviewer, it's a whole bunch of them. So what they'll do is they'll review it and they'll contact me and they'll say, hey, these are all the ways that you should be better. I fix it, go through the process again and again until people finally say that it's good science. Yeah.
I don't know if you remember a few years ago where the scientists had published that false article about vaccinations and how it leads to autism.
Yeah, so we're going to talk about that a little bit later.
Okay.
That exactly.
I was like, how does it get peer review?
I'll literally wait 20 minutes. We'll talk all about it. But yeah, good question. And you're right. How does it get there? So the aim of science and the reason why we do all these things, the reason why we share all this information, we do this research, we go through all of these processes, is not because we just like tinkering around in a lab, although we do, and it's not because we're just looking for the answers to specific questions. It's because we're actually trying to help improve quality of life. Like, that's the goal of science. That's the goal of all of these research projects. Everything goes back to improving quality of life, both for humans and for animals and for the planet in general. Okay? That's how, if you look at any biological question, that's what it's going to have its root in. So some of the super big examples that you guys are familiar with would be curing cancer, right? I think that everybody in this room would agree that we want a cure for cancer, right? That would be awesome. Everybody in some capacity has probably been affected by cancer. The other one is slowing the process of climate change. That's another one. We want to protect our planet, right? We want the planet to be around here for a long time. So that's another one that people in general are very supportive of, is making sure that this planet is around and operational long enough for you to be able to have kids and for your kids to be able to have kids. So because these are heavily and obviously rooted in quality of life for humans, these topics, climate change, cancer, are heavily, heavily funded by the government to do good research. So one question that I get a lot from my family being in science is, how on earth did they put those COVID vaccines out so fast? How did they do that? Heavily funded by the government, right? There was a need, and the government said, we will put so much money into making sure that this happens. That funding is oftentimes a kind of limiting reagent, I guess, for science. Because to be able to do research, to be able to do an experiment, you have to have money for it. And the government looks at specific needs and then funds science as it sees fit. Does that make sense? The government is oftentimes targeting quality of life for people, although it does fund quality of life for organisms and aquatic sources, stuff like that as well. So the ultimate goal of science is to benefit society. So this figure is in your text. This is just a blown up version of it for you to look through on your own time. It kind of just goes through and relates all these different properties of science. So exploring, testing, getting outcomes, and communicating them to other people. This should just be a review of what we've just talked about. But I wanted to show this to you so that if you do look over the text, you now know what exactly I'm referring to, okay? All right, so next we're going to talk about scientific theories, facts, laws, hypotheses, all that stuff, and how they relate to each other. In general lingo, in English, whatever, the word theory generally means an idea, right? I have this theory that if I started eating healthier, I would probably lose weight, right? You know what I'm saying? I have a theory that if I got a massage on Friday, I'd probably be happier. That's a theory in everyday language. When I use the word theory in this course, and when I use the word law in this course, I'm generally going to be talking about scientific theories. Scientific theories have a different definition. The definition of a scientific theory is a comprehensive and well-substantiated explanation that is broader in scope than a hypothesis. That is a little bit different than an idea. So what this means, because I'm into you guys as students not just memorizing the words that I give you to memorize, but to actually understanding it. When somebody does this, and they make it to this step, the scientific communication, there's 1,000 other scientists in the world that have all made it to this step as well, right? Research is being done every day, science is growing. If a whole bunch of scientists all get to this step of verifying their conclusions about the same topic, very similar hypotheses, all under one kind of roof, if a hypothesis has been verified over and over again by multiple different scientists, has gone through the peer review process, and is known to be good science, and it all supports one general idea, then we call it a theory. Also note the fact that this is highlighted, or bolded. What does that mean to you? Important. Learn it, right? I will do my best to bold vocab words or words that I think are very important, although I will say that anything, including figures, although this is a bad example of that, anything including figures is fair game for quizzes or exams, okay? Theories are very broad. A hypothesis is very specific, okay? Scientific theories are supported by a large, varied, and growing body of evidence. What that means is if at some point somebody comes up with a theory, such as the theory of evolution, what that means is that a lot of people, a large group, a varied group from different disciplines, must support it, and then also you must still be able to do science that supports this theory. Theories are so broad that they are used to explain many different observations in science and devise many different hypotheses. Additionally, because the theory is good science, and we're all about doing good science, if any sort of scientific evidence was uncovered that disproved a theory, that refuted a hypothesis, that refuted a theory, okay? Do you see what I'm saying? If we found anything related to a scientific theory that did not agree with it, we would completely, happily, and excitedly abandon this theory. Does that make sense? So in science, we have the theory of evolution. If a single scientist had ever found any sort of scientific evidence that disproved the theory of evolution, they would become very famous very quickly. And second of all, we would change or abandon the theory of evolution. The reason why the theory of evolution is still around in science is because nobody's found anything like that yet. Does that make sense? Okay? If you have questions about that, I highly encourage you to talk to me about it. I will not be condescending. All right, scientific facts. So fact is something that is objectively true based on all current evidence. So fact would be, this room has carpet. My shirt is red. We are at SVSU. We are in you know what I'm saying. That's a fact. People tend to think that science in general is just about accumulating facts. Science is not about accumulating facts. Accumulating facts is a byproduct of science. And going through this process, you will accumulate facts through observing, questioning, doing all this stuff. A fact is not an opinion. A fact can be verified. Opinions are totally fine. You should have them. They are not facts. Many people associate facts with science. Accumulating facts is not the goal. All right. So the people that have become famous in the world of science are not people that found the most facts. They are people that developed fundamental theories in science. These are some examples. Who is this guy? Einstein. Just about everybody recognizes him, right? What is he famous for? E equals MC squared. Great answer. Anybody else? Know anything about him? It's okay if you don't. I found this out when making the presentation. Yeah.
Theory of relativity.
Theory of relativity. That's the answer I was looking for. That is one of his big findings, or his work really supported that finding. The theory of relativity. So he's famous for uncovering laws and theories related to science, but theories are a big deal. Anybody know who this is?
Is that
Darwin. Is that what he said? Yeah. This is Charles Darwin. What is he famous for?
evolution?
Theory of natural selection, right? Evolution, all that stuff. These are cornerstones of science, and that's the reason why, even though this is 170 years after he lived, and I think he was in the 40s? So like 80, you know what I'm saying? We recognize these faces even without names. And I'm sure everybody in this room recognizes the name Albert Einstein and Charles Darwin. If you don't, that's okay. But yeah, so these big names in science are going to be people that contributed to these overarching theories that to this day still have not been disproven. So here's kind of a way to organize this information. Let's start on the left here. So observations about the world that you can verify are facts, and they lead into the development of a hypothesis. I'm going to point out right here, this is not the definition of hypothesis that I want you to know. The hypothesis that I want you to know is that it's testable and falsifiable. Okay? Don't forget that. Making a hypothesis contributes to or summates into a theory, which is a collection of hypotheses repeatedly tested to be valid, not yet proven wrong, explains a broad set of information. Okay? Physical definitions on the slide before, or 2 slides before. So this is different than a law. A scientific law is oftentimes going to be mathematical. If you like scientific laws, go take physics courses and math courses. They're often mathematical in nature. So theories are generally related to why something happens. So why is what we're seeing what we're seeing? Law is going to be describing what actually is happening. And so you can see how answering what is happening would need math. On the right here, there's a figure that kind of compares and contrasts some of the differences between theory and law if you have a hard time with it. For the sake of this class, I would just kind of keep in mind that scientific laws are generally going to be mathematical, and know that laws describe what happens when certain conditions are present. Theory describes why something happens. We're following? Okay. All right, so now I want to take what we've learned so far today and apply an example to it. So we're going to go through a scientific experiment. So just like this, here's a real scientific experiment. What I'm giving you guys right now is the background information. So that's which step? Observation and exploration. So we're going to spend the next few minutes watching this video and getting some observation and exploration. Hopefully sound is good.
Swimmers also come to ascension to breathe. A female green turtle approaches the coast. She's not eaten once in 2 months. She may have travelled 1,000 miles from her feeding grounds, the greatest journey of her kind. Many others are here too, resting on the sandy sea floor, awaiting the darkness of night when it'll be safer to visit the beaches. Eggs that were laid a few weeks ago at the start of the season are beginning to hatch. Most hatchings happen at night. Now, in the light of day, the young are extremely vulnerable. They must get to the sea as soon as possible. But but their trials have only just begun. Many will drown in the pounding waves. During the next 20 years, the vast majority will inevitably die. But those that survive will eventually, as their mothers did before them, return to the very same beach where they were hatched. How they find their way back across thousands of miles of open ocean, we still have no idea.
That ending right there would be so exciting if that music wasn't so obnoxious. It's like way too much to have before 4 o'clock. Alright, so that was your background information on baby green sea turtles. Hopefully you thought it was adorable. So can you see how from that information you could develop a couple of questions? There are a lot of questions that I had when I watched that. I'm sure you had some yourself. Why? Constantly wrestling with technology. Alright. So, if you didn't notice, or if you missed some information here, this is the life cycle of the green turtle. So, the adult female goes to the breeding grounds and comes up to the shore at nighttime and lays a whole bunch of eggs. A few weeks later, the eggs will hatch as little adorable baby turtles that we saw scurry off into the ocean. These guys will scurry off into the ocean, and somehow they have to make it 1,200 miles off to the feeding grounds. They will remain at the feeding grounds until they become a pregnant female who comes back to the breeding grounds to lay the eggs. Super weird, right? We don't know a lot about what happens between here and here. So obviously there's a whole group of scientists working in this specialized area to try and figure out what's going on. There are lots of questions. After watching that video, here's some examples of questions you might have had. How do turtles find the breeding ground? How does this mom know to go back to exactly the same place where she was laid to breed? Weird. They don't have GPSs. I couldn't do that. I can barely navigate home. How do turtles know when to hatch at nighttime? If they're in the sand, buried in the sand, how do they know when it's nighttime? How do turtles know where the ocean is when they hatch? Did you see them? They were all streamlined for that ocean. How did they know to go that way? Do they know how to swim, or do they just drift 1,200 miles? Can you imagine being born and being in the ocean for 1,200 miles swimming? Like, that's a lot. How do they do that? Do they swim? Do they drift? How do they get to the feeding ground? How do they find out where that is? So some scientists from the University of Florida, I believe, had a lot of these questions, and they developed a hypothesis related to the subject. They hypothesized that baby turtles must swim instead of drift to the feeding ground to travel so far. They developed an experiment. What they did is they took some juvenile turtles, they attached some satellite trackers, see right here, to their backs. What does the satellite tracker do?
Tracks
them. Their location.
Yeah, it tracks their location. So it's something that we can use underwater. So they did this for 24 juvenile turtles, and they also did this for 24 floating buckets. This is to identify if they are swimming or drifting. So they're comparing the drifting of the floating buckets. They released the turtles and the buckets at the same place at the same time, and they tracked the locations of each. What's the control group for this study?
The buckets.
Buckets. What's the other group called? The turtles. What are they called?
Experimental group.
Yep. Perfect. this is what they saw. So on the right here, you have this image, and the red is the turtles, and the blue is the buckets. Up here, it shows the distance traveled after a certain number of days. So after 14 days, what traveled further?
Turtles.
Turtles. Turtles traveled further than the buckets. They moved slowly, but they traveled further than the buckets. They also moved along different tracks. So this suggests that the juvenile sea turtles travel by swimming and not just drifting. Now here's a question. Does it prove that the turtles travel by swimming? Does it support the idea that they travel by swimming? Yes. Make sure you understand that distinction. It doesn't prove it, it just supports it. So to head towards this body of evidence, we would have to do different experiments set up in different ways to really be able to understand and make that a fact. All right, so a couple other things we have to talk about as far as experiments go are independent and dependent variables. So have you guys learned about these in high school?
Yeah.
Do you remember them being really confusing? Because I do for whatever reason, and maybe that's not the case for everybody. So this is my definition of an independent variable. Hopefully we can get through this together. The independent variable is what is being manipulated by the researchers. It's what is different, what is changing between the groups. Its outcome does not depend on the experimental component, and it's essentially what's different. A dependent variable is the response, the output, the thing that you measure. Its outcome does depend on the experimental component. So over here, we have an experiment where they're using different types of liquid to water each plant. So the independent variable is the type of liquid. The dependent variable is the height or health of the plant. The control group is to essentially use water. Now, the height of the plant depends on the liquid that is being used. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. Height depends on liquid, so therefore height is dependent. So, which component of the sea turtle experiment represents each type of variable? I know half of you guys have the notes in front of you. What's the independent variable? Yeah, either using turtles or buckets, because that is not influenced by the other part of the experiment, which is the speed or trajectory of movement. So, the way that I do this, if you ever get a question about this, the way that I organize it in my head is I literally set it up in a box like this, like independent, dependent. And then if you look at the turtle experiment, movement depends on if it's a turtle or a bucket, right? I work backwards. That's how I recommend you do this. I have a couple other examples for you guys, because this is something you should know, which means I will probably ask you a question about it. If Kaylee wants to determine the effect of fertilizer on the growth of grass, what depends on what?
The growth depends on the fertilizer.
Exactly. So then that makes the dependent variable growth, because dependent, right? And independent is fertilizer. We follow? A couple other examples. Ignore the he, she thing here. Go with it. Thomas wants to know if the type of detergent influences the cleanliness of her clothes. What's the independent variable?
Cleanliness depends on detergent.
Cleanliness depends on detergent, right? So what is the independent variable?
Detergent.
Detergent. And dependent is cleanliness of clothes. Are we following this? Okay. Madison wants to know if the amount of time spent on social media influences anxiety levels. Independent variable?
Anxiety levels.
Time on social media.
Anxiety levels depend on how much time on social media.
Anxiety levels depend on how much time is spent on social media, right? So anxiety levels is the dependent. Make sense? Okay. I know it's really confusing. Those words are very similar. This is how I keep it straight in my head. Hopefully it'll help you. There's a lot of examples on like the internet if you're struggling with that. Like you can do like Quizlets and stuff for that. All right, another important topic in experiments, reducing bias. So essentially people are biased because people are flawed and we mess up a lot and we don't necessarily do it on purpose. Experimental bias is any human behavior that can compromise the integrity of an experiment. These are often not conscious behaviors. So it's not like researchers are sitting there trying to mess up their experiment, right? Have you guys ever heard the expression that like a human cannot randomly generate a number? Has anybody heard that before? Like humans are not capable of just coming up with a random number. Like there's always a reason why you chose the number you chose, even if you don't realize it. So if you ever need a random number, you're supposed to go to a computer random number generator because that's a lot more random. Same sort of idea here. These are not conscious behaviors. You choosing what you think is a random number, like 561. I feel like that's random, but it's not. There's a reason why I chose it. It's not conscious, but it still exists. Having bias in experiments prevents effective results, and there's a lot of different ways this can happen. So one example of this might be, let's say you're doing an experiment and for whatever reason it involves fruit flies and butterflies. Okay? Would you rather spend your time looking at fruit flies or butterflies? Butterflies are prettier, right? So let's say that you are a researcher doing this experiment and you are analyzing the butterflies and you're so excited because they're so beautiful, so you analyze all the butterflies in the first week. Okay? Then you're out with COVID, then you're just not feeling so well, then you can't really remember how you analyzed the butterflies, and then 3 months later, whoever your research advisor is like, dude, you've got to do these fruit flies. Like, you can't just not do them. So they've been in the freezer for 3 months longer, they're starting to warp, lose their shape, you can't really remember exactly how you did the butterflies because it was so long ago, but you have to do it to get your research done. Do you guys see how that could cause issues? That's a type of bias. You're not doing it on purpose. You're not trying to cause issues with the experiment. It's just a problem. Our job in science and in research is to try and prevent this from happening. Another example of this, an example of effective ways to prevent bias would be, well, I guess I'll wait for the next slide. Okay, so here are some ways to prevent bias in research. These are some of the most common ways. The first is setting up a single blind experimental design. Essentially what this is making sure that the researchers don't know which group is the experimental group and which group is the control group. Let's go back to the test example we used earlier with the having students take an exam in a distracting environment. If I, as the person grading this exam, knew that this pile was distracted and this pile was not distracted, that could, even though it shouldn't, influence the grade that I give them. Because I could see these distracted students and be like, well, they were distracted, so, it makes sense that they put this. We don't want that. Single blind makes sure that all of those tests are shuffled together and I have no idea who is who. Make sense? Mm-hmm. Another example of this is in the turtle study that we just talked about. The person that's analyzing the satellite tracker data might not know which satellite tracker belonged to the buckets and which satellite trackers belong to the turtles. This is so that their human nature does not sway the results. That's a single blind study. Another type of experimental design is a double-blind research study. This is designed so that the researchers and the subjects or patients don't know which group is the experimental group and which group is the control group. This is really, really common in medical research. In medical research, when we're testing out new medications, we want to make sure that the patient is not biased towards what treatment they're getting. So imagine, let's go back to the example from earlier about you being a research student and you've developed the cure for cancer, right? Now you're holding clinical trials, so you're setting up a research to see how effective it is. You have 100 cancer patients that you are going to give the cure to cancer to, okay? You're going to give them your cure for cancer. Then you have another 100 patients, and you are not going to give them the cure for cancer, okay? You say, thank you for coming to my research study, you will not be getting the cure. Do you see how this could influence their, success, their symptoms, any sort of measurement of their health and well-being? You would not want to be in the group that does not get the treatment. So what we've designed in medicine is a placebo group. It's a group that gets a medically ineffective treatment, aka a fake pill. This allows the placebo group to serve as the control group. So what we say instead when we hold clinical trials, thank you for agreeing to be a part of my research project. You may be in either the treatment group or the control group, the placebo group, and I can't tell you which one you are in. Do you consent to being in one of these two groups? Now, neither the doctor nor the patient knows this, because if the doctor knew, the doctor might be biased. The doctor might say, yeah, they're not getting any treatment, so then the doctor might be spending more time with the treatment patient, with the ones who are getting the treatment. It might influence, even in subtle ways that they don't recognize, the way that the doctor provides this service to their patients. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. Therefore, the gold standard, especially for medical research, is to have double-blind, placebo-controlled studies, making sure that medication is tested in a double-blind, placebo-controlled way. Have you guys ever heard of the placebo effect? Mm-hmm. That's another reason why we do this, because people tend to feel better if they feel like they are getting treatment. They tend to report being better off if they think they are being treated. So this also reduces that component. Any questions about this? All right, next up, evaluating scientific claims. So pseudoscience is anything that claims to be science but did not follow all of these steps to get to where it needed to be. Okay? That's pseudoscience. Claim, belief, practice presented as science but lacks the valid scientific methodology or supporting evidence. So let's look at this. More doctors smoke Camels than any other cigarette. It's like an ad from the 40s or 50s before stuff like this was tightly regulated. It's like it may be true, but they're trying to push the wrong idea. Do you get what I'm saying? Mm-hmm. It's your job to evaluate claims, scientific claims, any other claims. You guys know that misinformation is a really, really big deal right now on the internet. People can post whatever they want to. Evaluating claims. Pseudoscience is generally supported by anecdotal evidence. Anecdotal evidence is essentially somebody else says that this is a good idea. Like more doctors, for example. Or my mom says, or millions of people say. With scientific claims, with pseudoscience, results cannot be duplicated. So the results of the study have not been able to be duplicated. It supports people's preconceived notions, and it tells people what they want to hear. Okay? That is how some of the best ways to identify pseudoscience. So here's an example of recognizing reliable sources. So on the left here, what we have is some images of the different COVID vaccines, right? We have, you guys can see the board okay, even though I'm sitting? Yeah. Okay. We have Moderna, AstraZeneca, Johnson & Johnson, Pfizer, all these stuff. A little excerpt here says, essentially FDA has cleared these for emergency use, all that stuff. When we go to this website, This is a .gov website. This is the Center for Disease Control. What you can also find is a ton of information about these vaccines. And if you scroll down, you can find all of the peer-reviewed and published research that is in support of this being safe for your body, safe for other people, and all the possible things that could go wrong. All the reasons why this is supported, why this is okay, why the scientific community has accepted it. This is just 2020, but obviously you guys have probably heard the talk about mRNA vaccines being scary, so this is all the research. Oh, that was just 2021. So it has all the research that supports that this is an okay decision going back a very, very long time. You can find these peer-reviewed journal articles. You can access them. You can read them. They are all very long. They are right on the CDC website. Does that make sense? Okay. They also have access to a document that shows you all the steps that these vaccines had to have done to actually be approved. It walks you through it. And there are published research articles for each step of the way that proves that this, supports that this is good science. Make sense? All right, let's read this other guy. Ephedra is back and legal, and it's the best weight loss the world has ever known. 100% organic. It's an all-natural herb that grows in China. It's been used by humans for many centuries. It's currently being used safely by millions of people. Our proprietary combination of ephedra, caffeine, and aspirin is optimally designed to maximize your weight loss with zero side effects. The pounds will literally fall off of your body, at least 5 to 8 pounds per week. Is this telling you what you want to hear?
Yeah.
I mean, maybe not all of you, but a lot of people would like to lose 5 to 8 pounds a week, right? Like, that's a real thing. So, all organic, all natural. People love that stuff, right? Like, we jump on those words, buzzwords. It's best weight loss aid the world has ever known. Millions of people have tried it. That's anecdotal evidence, right? Should you trust this? No. Unfortunately, a lot of people did, and a lot of people bought it. This is not FDA regulated. There is no scientific studies that support that this is okay, as far as I know. I guess I didn't really dive too far into it. But this substance, ephedra, is actually now banned in the United States because in 2003, it killed a Major League Baseball player who was taking it to lose weight. His name was Steve Batchelor of the Baltimore Orioles. And unfortunately, you guys probably know that in this world, sometimes it takes famous people getting hurt for things to change. Any questions about that? You guys get the point? This is a checklist. You should review it for recognizing reliable sources. Is it current, peer-reviewed? You know what I mean. Just how to make sure that you're finding good stuff. Oh, this was the part where I was going to talk about the vaccines cause autism. I can't believe I skipped over that. Okay, so vaccines causing autism. This falls under the pseudoscience category, that vaccines cause autism. And many of you have probably heard this claim before, right? Vaccines, autism, scientific research, scientific papers that support it. So the paper that came out that showed a correlation between vaccines and autism, I want to say came out in the 80s, but I don't know exactly off the top of my head. So this paper came out a while ago, and it showed that there was a rise in autism, which corresponded with a rise in vaccinations, as people were vaccinating their kids. So they thought that this supported their hypothesis, right? And it did. That correlation supports the hypothesis that vaccines and autism are related. That paper did go through the peer review process. That paper was submitted and considered very good science at the time. And since then, thousands and thousands of people have tried to replicate their experiment. They have tried to duplicate the results of this experiment, and they have not been able to. Thousands of people, especially as this has hit the kind of mainstream in the last 5 years or so. A lot of money has been put into trying to replicate the results of this experiment, and it hasn't been able to be done. So, because of that, now the scientific community has revoked that paper, because that's not a sign of good science. I should be able to publish a research article that shows you exactly what I did and how I did it, because if you've ever read a scientific article, that stuff's detailed, right? The whole point is to be able to replicate and reproduce experiments. Since this cannot be duplicated, it was revoked from the scientific community. Does that answer your question? There's more to it too, but that's really kind of like the main thing. Essentially, like there's the correlation versus causation argument too. You guys so there are more shark attacks when people are buying more ice cream, right? Does that mean that buying ice cream causes shark attacks? No. It just means that in the summertime, people are, that's probably what it is in the summertime people are buying ice cream, and in the summertime people are swimming in the ocean and having shark attacks. Same type of thing. All right, last little part of today. We're almost done, okay? This is a section about the properties that constitute life, how you can identify something as living. These right here: order, cells, growth and development, energy processing, regulation, response to the environment, evolution, and reproduction. You should know these. They are the property of life, and they are found in all living organisms. These are the recognizable properties of life. So for example, which of these properties would you find in a car? Would you find order in a car? I would argue that you do, right? Like you got like a steering wheel, that's more complicated than I understand. I don't know how to fix cars. That's pretty ordered. Do you have cells? Unless you're like sitting in it. I mean, in general, cars don't really have cells. They have batteries maybe, but that's not what we're talking about here. Do cars grow and develop? No, that would be absolutely terrifying. Do cars process energy? Yeah, you throw gas in, it goes. Are cars regulated? Mm-hmm. I mean, yeah, honestly, like by the government. Do cars respond to the environment when people are not in them? No. My car is going to get cold when it is -5 up. Do cars reproduce? No, that would also be terrifying. Do cars evolve?
Kind of.
Not by themselves.
The manufacturers help them evolve, but they don't on their own, right? So the point here is that a car is not alive, but a car has some of the features of life. Does it have all of the features of life? No, because it's not alive. So some things will have some, but not all of these features, and that's okay. But to be alive, they have to have all of them. You should know this list. Okay? This is a memorized list, but it's also a this should make logical sense list. And we'll talk about each of these things in more detail throughout the semester. Last topic is unifying themes in biology, and this is essentially going over a lot of what the major questions and hypotheses are formed around in science and biological research. So you guys can review this slide on your own time, how it relates to the green sea turtle, but I want to dive into what each of these things means, okay? So the relationship of structure to function. Structure of an organism, structure essentially means what does it look like and what is it made of. Function means what does it do and what is its job. Would a car function well if it didn't have wheels in its structure? No. The structure relates to the function, right? Structure of biological organisms oftentimes relates to their function. An example of that is a tennis racket. So I've never played tennis, but I imagine that you take the tennis racket and you hit the tennis ball. The structure of this, the wooden handle and the little webbing, right, is designed to hit the ball. How effective would this tennis racket be if it had a net instead of a hard surface where the racket is? Would it be effective for playing tennis? No, not at all. You would do a horrible job. Structure relates to function. This is true across almost all biological examples. So what you see in this image here is the human lungs. So we tend to think of the human lungs. I am not an artist. You guys will learn that about me. We tend to think of the human lungs as looking kind of like that, right? Now, these human lungs are actually filled with capillaries, which are really, really tiny blood vessels. You can see them right here. You see all of these capillaries? What that does is it increases the surface area of the lungs. Why might this be important? Yeah.
So the lungs can absorb more oxygen.
Yeah, exactly. The more surface area you have, the more oxygen you can absorb. So in reality, our lungs have all of these tiny capillaries, and you can see how much more exposure you have to absorb oxygen when you breathe because of these. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
So somebody might look at the lungs and say, why the hell do they look like that? That doesn't make any sense. In biology, the structure is almost always related to the function. So that's a big area of research, is what is the benefit of this structure? Why is this like that? Figuring out the function. Okay? Information flow. How do things happen in bodies? How do bodies know how to respond to certain things? For life's functions to proceed in an orderly manner, information must be received by living organisms, transmitted, and then used. An example of that is, diabetics will be familiar with this example. If I was to eat a candy bar, lots of sugar, that glucose would be released into the bloodstream, and then it would be recognized by my pancreas. My pancreas would act on that information and release hormones like insulin to kind of regulate the amount of glucose in the blood. Make sense? One area of scientific research is investigating and understanding how this information flows. An easier example, I think, to digest is this one. Muscle gains from strength training and diet changes, right? Your body is responding, and there is a flow of information that's happening throughout your system to cause you to go from looking like this to looking like this. Information flows that has to respond within your system to be able to have these changes. Does that make sense? We're almost done, guys. Let's power through. Just a couple more. This will be on your quiz. All right. Energy and matter. Pathways that transform energy and matter. We talked about how to be living. You have to be able to use energy in some capacity, right? Movement, growth, reproduction, cellular activities, they all require energy. In biological systems on Earth, the main and only form of energy is from the sun. It is solar powered. Even if you are a carnivore, right? So let's say you exclusively eat meat, if you eat meat, red meat, and it comes from a cow, you are getting your energy from the cow. Where is that cow getting its energy from?
The grass.
The grass. Where's the grass getting its energy from?
The sun.
Perfect. You guys see how this is true for biological systems. Main source of energy is the sun. And energy flows through a pathway that transforms it into different types of matter that can then be used as energy for other things. That is one area of biology that people spend a lot of time on. This is nutrient cycling, flows of energy and nutrients through ecosystems. Okay? We also have interactions between biological systems. So let's start at the top here with the biosphere. The biosphere is all of living life on planet. Okay? Everything living on the planet. The biosphere is made up of ecosystems. You guys probably have a pretty rough idea of what an ecosystem is, right? Like an area that's full of live things that live together. Within ecosystems, there are communities. Within communities, there are populations. Within populations, there are individual organisms. Me, I'm an organism. Within me, the organism, there are organ systems and organs, like the lungs I just drew out, right? Within those, there are tissues. My lungs are made up of tissues, different types of tissues. My tissues are made up of individual cells. My cells are made up of individual organelles. And the organelles are made up of individual molecules and atoms. You guys understand this? It's kind of like a trajectory of how organization of biological systems. So essentially one of the other areas of research is understanding how these relate to each other. How do the molecules relate to the organ systems? How do the organ systems relate to the population and to the biosphere as a whole? So kind of understanding and relating these to each other. And then there is evolution. So life is distinguished by its unity and its diversity. You guys are probably familiar with this. We have talked about observations earlier, botanical gardens and going to the zoo. We love the diversity of life. That's one of the things that makes us as humans so curious, is observing and understanding that. So there are multiple lines of evidence that point to life's unity, and evolution is an explanation for that. Some examples of that are similarities between fossils and living organisms, similarities within DNA, common cellular processes. We will talk about that more throughout the semester. So the scientific explanation for this unity seen throughout life is evolution, the process of change that has transformed life on Earth from being just a small single-celled molecule to being the complex humans and animals that we see today. So the last thing I think that I have for you guys today is this video. You know what? I have this posted on Canvas, so we can skip this as long as you guys watch it at home. It's a way to kind of see evolution in action, and it shows it through antibiotic resistance. So essentially, bacteria evolving the ability to resist antibiotics, which is a huge problem that we have today. So at the end of this, I have a summary of key topics here that we covered today, kind of like the way that it's organized. Do I have any questions? How do you guys feel? Think you survived? You can't wait to be back here next week? Alright, if you didn't hear my announcement earlier, I do teach 2 other sections of this course. If you didn't realize, you signed up for a Friday course. And throughout this week, seats have been opening up. I have a Monday, Wednesday from 2:30 to 3:50, and a Tuesday, Thursday from 2:30 to 3:50 section. The labs are at different times. If it fits your schedule, because you haven't missed the first week, you guys are welcome to switch courses. You just have to send me and the registrar an email. Okay? Just something to keep you in the know of, because I know a lot of people don't want to be here at 9 a.m. on Friday. Okay?